Elena Carter had always been the reliable one. At 32, she had carved out a life for herself that felt solid, if not glamorous. A senior financial analyst based in Austin, Texas, she paid her bills, drove a modest but fully owned Subaru, and had a decent-sized savings account that had taken her nearly a decade to build. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. But she was dependable, especially to her family. To them, she was more than a daughter or a sister. She was the fixer, the backup plan, the one who just knew how to handle money. Over the years, she'd helped her mom pay off a high-interest credit card, co-signed a loan when her younger brother wrecked his car, and quietly taken over the utility bills at her parents' house when her dad lost his job. During the pandemic, she never complained. Not out loud anyway. Love, she believed, sometimes meant stepping in without being asked. But nothing prepared her for what happened that night. At 3:35 a.m., her phone buzzed violently on the nightstand, dragging her out of sleep. Groggy, she reached for it, expecting maybe a storm warning or some spam text. Instead, it was a fraud alert from her bank. Your account balance is now minus $46,118.72. At first, she assumed it was a glitch. Her breath caught in her throat as she rubbed her eyes and stared harder. The red negative balance didn't blink away. Her fingertips froze above the screen. For a moment, it felt like the entire room had tilted. She sat up, the sheets falling to her waist as she tapped into her banking app. Not only was the money gone, her checking account had been emptied down to the overdraft line, but there were dozens of transfers to accounts she didn't recognize. She pulled up the transaction history, heart pounding. Several withdrawals had occurred over the last 5 days. Some are labeled as wire transfers, some as Zelle payments. All of them are large. She couldn't breathe. Her hands moved faster than her brain. She called her father first. It rang twice before he picked up. She could hear music in the background. Laughter, a party. "Hey kid," his voice slurred slightly. "You okay, Dad?" "Something's wrong. My account, it's overdrawn. By a lot. I think someone's stolen my—" All right, he interrupted, sounding more annoyed than alarmed. "Don't get dramatic. We just needed a little help. We—" Her voice went quiet. Ice cold. There was a pause. Then her mother came onto the line, her tone sharper, more casual, like they were discussing what to make for dinner. "Relax, Elena. Your dad had some medical bills. Your brother's truck broke down again. The mortgage was behind. We needed to catch up. You used my account?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Without telling me. We didn't think we had to," her mother replied, as if it were obvious. "You've always said money isn't everything. Besides, what were you going to do with that money? Buy yourself more books and candles. We had better use for it." Elena gripped the phone tightly. Her knuckles went white. "That was my emergency fund. You emptied my savings." Her father let out a low grunt. "Elena, you owe us. Don't forget everything we did for you. This family sacrificed so much for you to succeed." The words landed like a slap. "You owe us." Suddenly, she wasn't 32 and independent. She was 14 again, standing in a freezing kitchen, holding a past-due electricity bill, listening to her mom say, "We wouldn't be in this mess if you didn't eat so much." Elena swallowed hard. Her voice didn't shake when she answered, "Don't ever touch my money again. And don't ever call me like this again." "Elena, don't be ridiculous," her mother snapped. "We're family. You don't just walk away from that." "I'm not walking away," she said quietly. "I'm cutting the cord." And she hung up. The silence afterward rang in her ears. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she sat in bed in the dark, back straight, phone still in her hand, screen gone black. The numbers echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. $46,118.72. That number wasn't just a figure. It was a truth, brutal and bright, that had been waiting to be seen for years. They hadn't asked, they hadn't apologized, they had simply taken. And expected her to understand. Elena didn't sleep after hanging up. She stared at the ceiling as the early morning light leaked through the blinds, her mind already mapping out a to-do list in defense. But beneath the strategy was something quieter. older. Like a pain she had trained herself not to feel for years finally rising to the surface. At 6:10 a.m., she got out of bed and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop. The coffee was still brewing when she began digging through her digital life one account at a time. Within an hour, the shock turned into something else entirely. She hadn't allowed herself to realize just how many bills she was silently paying for people who treated her like a safety net with no limit. Her parents' water and electric bills were on autopay from her checking account. Their car insurance, too. She had added it herself 2 years ago just until they got caught up. She logged into her online loan portal and confirmed what she'd pushed to the back of her mind. She was still an O-signer on her brother Ryan's truck. He had missed 3 payments last year, she'd covered them without a word and without him ever saying thank you. Her sister Maria's student loans were there too. Elena had co-signed the consolidation under the promise that it would be temporary. Maria had defaulted twice. Elena had absorbed the impact quietly afraid of what a delinquency would do to her credit. The full picture was worse than she'd imagined. Elena sat back in her chair stunned. Over time, she had allowed herself to become a silent donor to everyone else's survival and their comfort. It wasn't just money, it was the emotional weight of being the responsible one. The one who never broke. The one who never needed. Her phone buzzed again, a bill reminder. Her parents' cell phone plan also in her name. Of course. As the list grew longer, she began making a spreadsheet. Electricity, water, internet, 2 car payments, a loan. Insurance policies. 3 streaming services. A pharmacy membership. A gas card. All in her name. She labeled the top of the file "Debt I Mistook for Love." She'd always believed helping her family meant loving them. But now, looking at the cold facts, she wondered if love should ever feel this invisible. This one-sided. Her mind drifted back to when it had started. She was 15. Her mom had been sitting on the couch crying over a bottle of expired Tylenol. They couldn't afford her prescription that month. Her dad had pawned the television. Elena went to the school library the next morning and asked if they had any work. She began shelving books after school for $6.25 an hour and gave every paycheck to her mother without hesitation. No one asked her to. But no one stopped her either. That was the beginning of it, the silent agreement that Elena would hold the world together while everyone else made excuses. Even then, her parents told her she was so mature, such a little adult. She used to beam with pride at those compliments. Now she wondered if they were just early labels for a role she never had the chance to refuse. Her family had never been poor, not in the way that headlines showed. They were textbook middle class. A small house in San Antonio, 2 cars, birthdays with store-bought cake. But money always seemed to vanish. Her parents lived just outside their means, always chasing some version of catching up that never lasted more than a month. They leased new cars before old ones were paid off. Signed up for cable bundles, gym memberships, gadgets, and subscriptions. Her mom once financed a $900 massage chair and asked Elena to just cover the first few payments. Looking back now, Elena saw it clearly. They didn't struggle, they avoided responsibility. And she had been their buffer, first emotionally, then financially. What broke her heart wasn't that they'd taken the $46,000 without asking. It was that they never thought they needed permission. That her hard work, her planning, her stability were somehow communal property. She thought about the birthday cards with no money inside. The calls only came when bills were due. The way her mom once cried when Elena said she might take a sabbatical year. But who's going to help if something happens? Who indeed? The more she scrolled, the more her throat tightened, not from sadness but clarity. This wasn't generosity anymore. It was emotional taxation. She hadn't been helping her family. She'd been financing their avoidance. And the worst part, they still believed she owed them. Elena didn't scream. She didn't call anyone to demand answers. She didn't even send a single angry text. She'd already learned that in her family, shouting only gave them something to push back against. Emotion, no matter how justified, was ammunition for manipulation. This time there would be no outburst. No warning. No chance for guilt to rearrange her boundaries. Only action. By 8:00 a.m., She had made a second cup of coffee and opened her financial dashboard on her laptop again. The betrayal was already done, so she began dismantling the system that made it possible. The first thing she did was shut down the 2 supplementary credit cards that she had given her mother and her brother for emergencies only. Her mother had once used it to pay for her cat's vet bill. Her brother had used it to rent a jet ski on his birthday. Elena had justified it all, told herself it was harmless. It wasn't. She logged into her credit card account and deactivated both cards permanently. Not paused. Not frozen. Cancelled. Then she changed the account's PIN security questions and removed the stored contact information for both of them. It felt surgical precise and strangely empowering. Next came her checking account, the one that had been emptied. She called the fraud department, her voice steady and calm. "Yes, I'm reporting unauthorized use," she said, typing into her Notes app while on hold. No, the users were not legally added to the account. They accessed it through saved credentials. "I didn't approve the transfers." The agent on the other end tried to ask if she knew the people who made the transactions. Elena hesitated only for a breath. "I don't feel safe disclosing that," she replied. By the time the call ended, the case was escalated and flagged. The bank placed a hold on all activity and began the investigation process. Whether or not she'd ever recover the funds, the bleeding had stopped. Then she moved on to the loan accounts, the ones she had co-signed out of loyalty, guilt, or both. She started with her brother's truck loan. The customer service rep explained that removing a cosigner was a process that required refinancing approval and a written reason. "My financial situation has changed," Elena said smoothly. "I'm reassessing my debt exposure and personal obligations. I need to initiate the release process immediately." She knew the language. She worked in finance. She knew exactly what to say and what not to say. She made the same call about her sister's student loan consolidation. Same explanation, same tone. Financial instability. Need to separate responsibilities. Some requests were processed immediately. Others required formal paperwork. That was fine. She had time now, time and boundaries. When she finished the calls, she logged out of every account she could think of: utilities, insurance, shopping platforms, even the old Hulu account they all used, and began the process of resetting passwords, one by one. Every single one. No more shared logins. No more just this once. She deleted saved payment methods, unlinked her cards, changed email recovery addresses. She updated her phone's 2-factor authentication to her work device only. By noon, her digital footprint had shrunk down to something that finally felt like hers. What surprised her most was the absence of panic. She didn't feel scared, she felt clear. She hadn't even cried yet. This wasn't rage, this was reclamation. But she also knew some of this would go beyond her personal to-do list. The deeper cuts, legal, contractual, would need more than a few clicks and calls. So she opened a new browser tab and typed "Family Law Attorney Asti N. Texas Independent Financial Protection." She scheduled an initial consultation for the next morning. She didn't shop around. The bio said specializing in protecting individual assets in complex family structures. That was enough. The idea of a lawyer used to make her feel cold. Now it made her feel warm. Safe. She pulled out a notebook and began making a list titled "Things I Need to Untangle." Remove name from mortgage refinance. Cut joint cell phone plan. Close the backup emergency fund account mom had the password. Reclaim car insurance bundle. Update the will and power of attorney. She paused at the last one. She'd once put her mother as her medical power of attorney. It had felt logical. Loving. Now the idea felt absurd. She couldn't trust her with an Amazon order. How could she trust her with her life? Elena looked at the clock. It was only 1:37 p.m. Just that morning she'd woken up robbed, and now she was finally taking her name back from systems, from contracts, and from people who had stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a solution. She hadn't raised her voice once. But somehow her silence had never been louder. The backlash came quickly. By the following morning, Elena's phone was buzzing like it had caught fire. Calls. Texts. Missed FaceTimes. Notifications stacked on top of one another like a digital avalanche. From her mother, her brother, her sister, and even cousins she hadn't heard from in months. At first, she didn't answer. She couldn't. Her hands trembled just picking up the device. She watched the screen light up over and over, name after name, flashing some with crying emojis, others with all caps. By noon, her voicemail was full. She sat on the edge of her bed listening to them in order, one by one, each one a different weapon dressed in the voice of someone who once said, "I love you." Her mother's voice was sharp and familiar. "I cannot believe you did this. You changed, Elena. You used to be good. You used to care." Her brother's voice was more casual but laced with a simmering rage. "So what now? You just cut us off. You think you're better than us because you have a job and an apartment in the city. Don't forget who took care of you when you were nothing." Then came the pleading. "Sweetheart," her aunt's voice cracked slightly. "Your dad's not doing well. His blood pressure is out of control. The stress is making it worse. You don't want something to happen to him, do you?" That was her mother again in a later message. Softer. Slippery. "If we hurt you, I'm sorry, but family forgives each other. Your father needs help. Real help. Are you going to let him suffer because you're mad?" Elena had expected anger. She hadn't expected how fast they'd pivot to guilt. They had weaponized love turned "we care about you" into "we expect from you," and then into "you're cruel for not giving more." It was a cycle, one she suddenly saw with razor-sharp clarity. Whenever she said no, they didn't hear boundaries. They heard betrayal. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she opened her journal, something she hadn't written in for nearly a year. Her handwriting was a little shaky at first, but soon the words found their rhythm. "Love that only exists when you're useful is not love. Love that requires your silence, your sacrifice, your suffering, that's not family. That's conditioning. That's currency disguised as care." She paused. If you have to break yourself to keep peace, it was never peace to begin with. The pages filled with the kind of truth she had been too tired or too afraid to say out loud. But now there was no space for pretending. No room for guilt to make its nest. It wasn't that her family had suddenly turned on her, it was that she had stopped playing the role they wrote for her, and they didn't know how to handle her absence. Or her strength. They weren't calling to apologize, they were calling to reclaim control. And for the first time, Elena didn't feel afraid of disappointing them. She felt insulted that they thought guilt would still work. There was one message from her sister Maria that made her laugh out loud, dark and bitter. "Just because you can afford to say no now doesn't mean you should. You're acting like some cold-hearted stranger. You think money makes you better than us." Elena didn't answer. She didn't even draft a response. She didn't owe anyone her pain just to make theirs feel lighter. Later that evening, a family group chat she'd long muted suddenly changed names. It was now titled "The Real Ones." Someone had removed her from the list entirely. A cousin screenshot it and sent it to her without comment. Elena stared at the image for a while, emotionless. They weren't even subtle about it. It wasn't a conversation anymore, it was exile. But instead of hurting, it confirmed what she already knew. They were only united in crisis when it came to what she could provide. Not when she was tired, not when she needed support. Only when they were falling apart and wanted someone else to fix it. She took a deep breath, lit a candle on her kitchen counter, and whispered to herself, "This is the silence I chose. The silence that protects me." Because she was finally learning loving someone didn't mean setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. She closed the group chat. Deleted the voicemails. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel cold for walking away. She felt free. The next step wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a confrontation. Elena didn't go to her parents' house and scream at them on the lawn. She didn't post a long essay online. She simply did something her family had never expected from her. She disappeared from reach. The first brick in her new boundary was small but powerful. She changed her phone number. No warning. No explanation. She walked into a local carrier office, requested a number change, and within 30 minutes, the number that had lived in every family contact list for over a decade was dead. The new one was given only to her closest friends, and none of them shared it. There would be no more middle-of-the-night guilt calls. No more frantic voicemails about overdue bills disguised as emergencies. No more backdoor access to her peace. She didn't stop there. At her kitchen table in the same spot where she'd once paid their bills and ordered them groceries, Elena wrote something that took her longer than anything else, a letter. Handwritten. No sarcasm, no bitterness. Just the truth. I don't hate you. I'm not angry anymore. I simply can't be responsible for your lives. Not your bills, not your mistakes, not your choices. From now on, I will not be the one to carry what you refuse to hold yourselves. I wish you peace. I truly do. But I can't keep hurting to keep the illusion of family alive. We are each responsible for our own lives now. She signed her name, sealed the envelope, and mailed one copy to her parents, one to each sibling. She didn't expect a response. That wasn't the point. This wasn't revenge, this was released. Next, she took out the stack of unpaid invoices and account links she had once filed under Family Essentials, a quiet list of things she'd taken on simply because it was easier for her. The Netflix account had her name, her card, and was used in at least 4 houses. The cell phone plan, hers for almost 7 years, covered 5 lines, only one of which was hers. The gas account for her parents' home had been under her name since their credit was too low to apply on their own. She used to tell herself it wasn't a big deal. It's just $60 a month. It's just one more thing. It helps them. Now she saw the truth. Every small thread was part of a net. One was designed to keep her close, useful, and emotionally entangled. So she cut them one by one. Netflix canceled. Phone plans switched to an individual account. All other users dropped. Gas and electric. Closed the accounts. Let them reopen in their own names with their own credit. That night, Elena slept better than she had in weeks. Until the next morning, when the storm began. Her cousin forwarded her a screenshot of a family group chat. Did Elena shut off the Wi-Fi at Mom and Dad's? The landline's not even working. Another message came in: Netflix isn't working. Someone check with her, but they couldn't. Because her number no longer worked. And her name was gone from their digital lives, just like it had been wiped from the bills. The real panic came later that week when her mother's phone stopped working. Then the gas shut off. Then the Amazon Prime account declined. The silence Elena had built became a wall they couldn't climb, and they didn't know how to cope without her holding the ladder. They tried everything. Messages from relatives. Emails from alternate addresses. One even sent her a Venmo request for back pay. Elena didn't respond. Not because she didn't see it, but because she finally understood what her silence was worth. For years she had believed that her love could be measured in utility bills and subscription fees. That being a good daughter meant quietly filling in the cracks left by bad choices. But now she was building something else. A life where love wasn't based on obligation. Where family didn't mean sacrifice without consent. A world where her energy was her own. They called her cruel, selfish, cold, but she wasn't any of those things. She was just unavailable. And for the first time, that wasn't an apology, it was a boundary. Elena changed her number without telling anyone. No announcement, no explanations. One quiet trip to the phone store on a rainy Wednesday afternoon where she handed over her old SIM card and watched the clerk cut it in half. That simple snip felt louder than any argument she could have had. A symbolic silence. The kind that made it clear the door was still visible, but it would no longer open. Then she sat at her small kitchen table, the same table where she used to cook for 5 balance bills, answer midnight phone calls from panicked cousins, and wrote a letter by hand. Her pen moved slowly, deliberately, as if she were writing a will or something holy. I don't blame any of you. Not for choosing him, not for staying quiet when I was drowning in this house. But from now on, every person must carry their own life. I won't carry anyone anymore, not emotionally, not financially. Not administratively. Love, Elena. She signed it without tears, folded the page into 3 careful creases, and slipped it into an envelope. The return address wasn't her apartment anymore. She had rented a new P.O. box across town under a different name somewhere. No one in her family would think to check. That same day, she drove to the utility company with a small stack of papers. Netflix. Cell phone, gas, water, internet. Even the old landline her father insisted on keeping for emergencies. All of them were still in her name, signed years ago just to make things easier. Because she had good credit. Because she was the one who paid on time. Because it was only temporary. The temporary had lasted 8 years. She transferred everything. Not to anyone else's name, though. She simply removed herself from the accounts. No signature. No replacement. Just gone. By the time the sun set, her name was no longer tethered to anyone else's comfort. It took about a week before the calls started. Netflix was the first to go. Her younger cousin messaged her on Instagram, confused and annoyed. "Hey, the account's asking for payment, did you change the password?" She didn't respond. 2 days later, her mother's voice was on voicemail. "Elena, something's wrong with the gas. I tried to heat the water this morning and it wouldn't work. You know we can't afford a technician right now. Can you just call and fix it?" Elena listened to the message in silence. Then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but out of resolve. The phone company called her brother directly. He tried to reach her, panicked when he realized the family plan had collapsed and his number had been flagged for unpaid bills. He left a voice note, his tone somewhere between blame and desperation. "Elena, what are you doing? Why didn't you tell us I have interviews this week and I need my phone? Don't be like this. Just fix it and we'll talk, okay?" She stared at his message for a long moment and then archived it. The silence she gave in return was not revenge. It was a boundary, something no one in her family had ever respected when she whispered, cried, begged, or warned. But now she didn't speak. And somehow that said everything. They tried calling from different numbers, texting from their children's phones, even showing up at her old apartment only to find the lights off and a quiet neighbor shrugging. "She doesn't live here anymore." Elena didn't block them, she didn't have to. She had simply disappeared from their dependency network, brick by brick, bill by bill. And they were finally learning what life looked like when she wasn't the invisible glue. They came to her door like ghosts returning to haunt a place they once called home. It was a Sunday morning. The kind of morning that used to mean cleaning the house for unannounced visits, setting out extra cups just in case someone dropped by, and biting her tongue while someone else finished the sentence she had started. But not this Sunday. This Sunday, Elena sat on her sofa with a blanket draped over her legs, a steaming cup of black coffee in her hand, and her gaze fixed calmly on her phone screen. The home security app blinked to life, and through the lens of the door camera she watched her family scream. Her mother was at the front, pounding the door with a flat palm, her voice rising and cracking between sobs and accusations. Behind her, Elena's brother paced in agitation, waving his arms like someone who had just been robbed. 2 aunts had come too. One of them was crying so loudly it echoed through the hallway, while the other held up her phone like she was documenting a crime scene. "Elena, open this door, for God's sake, you don't get to disappear." What kind of daughter, what kind of person does this? They shouted like victims. Like someone had died. Like love had been betrayed. Elena took another sip of coffee. It was dark and slightly bitter, just the way she liked it. In her other hand she held an old folder. It was one of the last ones she hadn't shredded. Inside were crumpled receipts, payment confirmations, and years of silent transactions. Her signature on the family internet. Her credit card was on her brother's dentist bill. The gas bills in her name. Her mother's emergency medication order from 6 months ago, delivered with next day's shipping, paid entirely from Elena's savings. She flipped through them without flinching now. She didn't feel anger. She didn't even feel sadness. She felt clarity. There was a time when she would have rushed to unlock the door, when the sound of her mother's voice breaking would have shattered something inside her, when her brother's guilt-laced lectures would have been enough to make her say fine and fix it all again. But today she felt nothing except a strange, powerful quietness in her chest. Because this time she finally understood. She wasn't afraid of disappointing them anymore. She was afraid of disappearing into them. She had spent so many years feeding a system that only grew hungrier. Saying yes to keep the peace. Swallowing her exhaustion to keep the family functioning. Wearing strength like armor while everyone else cried and collapsed. And for what? so they could stand outside her door now screaming like they were entitled to her body, her name, her signature. Elena placed the coffee cup down gently and leaned back against the cushion. Her apartment was warm, clean, quiet. For the first time in her adult life, there wasn't a single piece of mail in her name that didn't belong to her. The camera feed was still running. Her mother had now slumped to the floor, sobbing into her hands like the victim in a tragedy. Her brother kicked the front step. One of the aunts looked directly into the lens. Elena, this is madness. Are you going to erase your whole family over a few bills, over some hurt feelings? It would have hurt her once. That sentence. But now she turned off the feed. They didn't know it yet, but the war was already over. And Elena had won, not with revenge, not with confrontation, but with something far more radical. Silence. She stood, stretched slowly, and walked to her desk. Her laptop blinked to life. She opened her email. There was a draft waiting, one she had written 2 days ago but hadn't sent yet. She read it one last time before clicking send. To L.K. Henderson Law Office, subject request to finalize separation. Dear Miss Henderson, please proceed with the paperwork to formally dissolve any remaining legal or financial connections between me and my family members. This includes but is not limited to joint liabilities, co-signatures, and emergency contact authorizations. I understand the implications and confirm that this is my final decision. This is not a reactive act. It is a protective one. Thank you for helping me close this chapter with dignity. Sincerely, Elena M. Torres. She hit send. Then, for the first time in a long time, she breathed deeply, without weight, without fear of who might be waiting on the other end of her phone. Outside, the world kept spinning. Somewhere in a hallway, her mother was still weeping. Her brother is still angry. Someone was still muttering about how cold Elena had become. But none of it mattered now. Because when you stop defending yourself to people who only love you when you're useful, you become untouchable. She closed her laptop, picked up her mug, and walked to the window. The sky outside was bruised with soft grays and golds, the kind of sky that promises a storm but also maybe peace after. Elena stood there for a long time, watching the clouds move until the last echoes of shouting faded into the wind. It had been 1 year. No phone calls, no guilt-drenched voicemails. No forwarded bills, no quick questions, no texts masked as concern but soaked in control. Just silence. Elena lived in a new apartment now, smaller but all hers. White walls, wooden floors, a tiny balcony where the sunlight poured in each morning like a quiet promise. The lease had her name and only her name on it. The Wi-Fi, the utilities, the emergency contact form at her new workplace, all hers. It had taken 3 months to stop checking her phone every time it buzzed, expecting it to be her mother or worse, her brother writing something that sounded kind but came with a trap. 4 months to stop rehearsing explanations in the mirror. 6 months to start sleeping through the night. And now, a full year later. Peace. Not the kind that comes after everything has been resolved, but the kind you earn when you stop begging people to understand you. She had rebuilt everything from the ground up. New friends. Friends who didn't know about the family drama or the years of financial entanglement. Friends liked her not because she showed up with solutions, but because she showed up with laughter, curiosity, and her soft presence. She worked in a small design studio, now nothing grand but hers. After years of hiding her ambition to keep the family comfortable, she had finally let herself want things again. Beauty, creativity, autonomy. She bought her coffee maker. She lit candles at night even when no one was coming over. She danced barefoot in the kitchen. She read books without guilt. She learned how to be her witness. Then came her birthday. It landed on a Thursday this year, tucked neatly into a busy week. She didn't expect much. Honestly, she had told herself she didn't even care. There were no texts from her mother. No calls from her father. No envelope from any of the aunts, the cousins, the people who used to say things like family is everything as long as she was paying the bill. The quiet of it all was both sharp and clean, like a window finally shut against the cold. By late afternoon, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the balcony with a small journal. The light was soft. The wind carried the scent of someone baking cinnamon nearby. She wrote, This is the first birthday where no one expected me to prove I was worth being loved. Just as she was closing the book, a knock echoed from her front door. 3 times. Familiar. Playful. Elena rose slowly, expecting a neighbor or maybe a delivery she forgot she ordered. But when she opened the door, it was Ava. Her best friend. The one who had shown up in her life just after the collapse, offering no advice, just presence. Ava stood there holding a cake box in one hand and 2 small candles in the other. "I didn't text," she smiled, stepping inside, "because I wanted to see your face when you opened the door." Elena laughed, startled. "You didn't have to, I wanted to," Ava cut in gently. "Also, it's chocolate, and it's ugly because I baked it myself." They sat on the couch, legs tucked under them, the cake balanced on a ceramic plate between them. Elena hadn't realized how much she had missed this shared laughter, small messes, the comfort of someone knowing you well enough to just show up. No need to earn it, no need to apologize for the things you don't give anymore. As they lit the candles, Ava leaned back and studied her. "You know," she said slowly, "you haven't changed as much as you think." Elena tilted her head, surprised. "Haven't I?" "No," Ava said, her voice soft and steady. "You didn't change. You just stopped letting other people define your value." The words hit something raw. Elena hadn't cried all year. Not when her mother sent a final cruel message. Not when her father ghosted her completely. Not when she signed the last document cutting legal ties from everyone she used to call family. But this simple sentence spoken without fanfare broke the dam. Tears spilled quietly, falling into her lap like small sacred freedoms. "I didn't think anyone saw that," she whispered. "I did," Ava said. "And so did you. You just forgot for a while." They sat in silence for a while after that. Not the kind of silence that demands to be filled, but the kind that holds you like an old blanket. And as the candles burned low, Elena realized something she hadn't been able to say until now. She didn't miss them. She didn't miss the birthday texts that came with invisible strings. The calls that always ended in guilt. The family dinners where she left full of food but hollow inside. She missed the idea of family, but not the version she'd been given. Now, sitting across from someone who chose her without obligation, Elena felt more seen, more known than she ever had during a decade of bending to earn her place. This year, she turned 33. No one called. No one showed up from her past. And yet this was the first year that felt like hers. The invitation had arrived in the mail 2 months ago, an old friend's wedding tucked in the countryside with white tents and lilac flowers, and a guest list full of shared memories. Elena had almost declined. Not because she didn't love the bride, she did. They had once danced barefoot in dorm rooms and cried over midnight pizza and whispered dreams into the dark. But she knew with painful certainty who else would be there. Family. The kind that used to be hers by blood. The kind that still carried her childhood inside their memory like a secret weapon. The kind who hadn't called in a year, not even on her birthday. The kind who, if they showed up, would stare like she'd abandoned them when the truth was she had simply saved herself. But something in her had changed. Not hardened, no, she wasn't colder, just clearer. She didn't owe anyone an explanation for becoming whole. So she RSVP'd yes. The venue was beautiful. A converted vineyard, sunlit and quiet, wrapped in linen and laughter. Elena arrived in a long sage green dress, her hair soft around her shoulders, her eyes calm. She didn't wear anything dramatic, no need to shout her transformation. It was there in her posture, in her silence, in the fact that she no longer looked over her shoulder to brace for disappointment. People turned when she entered, not out of shock, but out of warmth. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected to feel welcomed. She sipped champagne under a willow tree and let the sound of music weave through her bones. She danced once. She laughed. She hugged the bride. For hours it was just joy, until it wasn't. She felt it before she saw it, the shift in the air, the tension in her spine. A knowing. The kind of knowing you carry deep in your blood even after you cut the rope. Her mother was there. Of course she was. An old family friend. Always good at appearances. Elena saw her near the back of the reception tent, standing still in a pale pink shawl. Her hair had more gray now. Her posture was a little smaller than Elena remembered. For a long time they didn't speak. Then, just before dessert, Elena stepped out toward the garden path for air. She was halfway to the lavender rose when she heard footsteps behind her. Her mother's voice followed, soft but pointed. Con nin kakwa. You look so different. Elena turned calmly. She didn't feel fear. Just stillness. The same stillness that had taken her years to earn. She studied her mother's face. It held the same lines. The same polished sadness. But something in her eyes looked older, like someone who had finally realized the door she used to walk through no longer opened. Elena smiled gently. I look different, she said, because I finally stopped seeing myself through your mirror. The words weren't sharp, they weren't cruel, they were clean. Honest. Grounded in a truth she no longer had to defend. Her mother didn't speak right away, and for the first time in Elena's life her silence wasn't a weapon. It wasn't cold, it was recognition. It was grief. Her eyes flickered, not with anger, not with shame, but with something closer to loss. Like someone standing in front of a door that had always been open, now finding it sealed. They stood in the quiet together for several seconds. Her mother opened her mouth once, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but no words came. Just a small nod. Barely noticeable. But Elena saw it. And for the first time in years she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like the child trying to earn love through usefulness, obedience, or silence. She was just Elena. Whole. Present. Free. Her mother turned and walked away, back into the noise of the reception, leaving Elena alone beneath the lavender sky. But she didn't feel alone. She stood there breathing, just breathing, letting the moment pass through her without needing to fix it. She had carried too much for too long. All those years of translating guilt into sacrifice, of mistaking duty for love, of abandoned herself for the illusion of family. And now she was done. That night, as the stars came out and the last of the cake was served, Elena slipped out quietly, barefoot in the grass, her heels in one hand. She didn't need a dramatic exit. She didn't need a final confrontation. Because nothing dramatic had happened. Just something true. The kind of truth that comes when you stop running toward people who only love the version of you they can control. She walked to her car, the country air soft on her skin, and as she turned the key in the ignition, one final thought settled in her chest like peace. I am no longer the one who carries everyone. I didn't abandon my family. I simply stopped abandoning myself.